I'm Robin Ewing, and with Michael Anderson, I co-direct the Create Centre, Creativity in Research, Engaging the Arts, Transforming Education, Health and Wellbeing. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm sure that we have a real treat thinking about how art making in schools is good for us all. But before I introduce Georgia, I would like to acknowledge our First Nations Australians. And I'm joining from Darug country. You might like to put in the chat where you're joining from. I want to acknowledge that our First Nations Australians, and really, I think all Indigenous are much better at putting the arts and story at the centre of their knowing, doing, being, and becoming, and how much we have to learn from them. I also want to acknowledge that they have looked after our wonderful country for so many thousands of years, and that the land was never ceded, always was, always will be Aboriginal land. So tonight we're going to hear about how art making in schools is good for us all. Georgia is one of the best people I know to do this webinar. She is an artist, a teacher, an art therapist, and a founder of the Therapeutic Art Play program. Georgia, we're really looking forward to hearing about this. Anyone who has questions, please don't hesitate to put them in the chat. And we'll hopefully have time for some questions and discussions at the conclusion of Georgia's presentation. Thank you, Georgia.
Thank you, Robin. Thank you for joining everybody. This is really exciting for me and a huge honour to be able to present with Create. I just want to extend my appreciation of the kind of space that you make for us to come and share our ideas and play together with these kinds of ideas. It's so vital. It's so inspiring. So I just want to say thank you for having me. And I'm really keen to talk about how art working is good for us and what art working is. And I join from Wongal country. So I'm going to share my screen. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what this art working thing is and how it's good for us, specifically how art working together is good for us in educational settings, and how we can facilitate for that kind of art working in educational settings. Yeah. So the vehicle with which I'm going to be sharing this is, I'm going to be talking about the Therapeutic Art Play program, as Robin mentioned. And yeah, the Therapeutic Art Play program is a program that brings creative spaces that are focused on, that word space is really vital, creating a space for the development of strategies for well-being and for learning into educational settings using art therapy practices and art therapy directives. It's not necessarily a therapeutic, it's not clinical art therapy. We're not doing clinical art therapy with children and teachers. It's not specifically an educational space. We're not aimed at learning outcomes or learning directives, and it's not an art lesson. We're not necessarily specifically aiming at teaching the techniques of visual art, although all of these things are in our tool belt and we can bring them to the space when and if they're necessary, or when and if they're asked for or appropriate or joyful and happy. Okay, so I will talk a little bit about this presentation and the way I've thought about putting it together, because art working is this big tangled up beautiful thing that we do, and the TAP program is the same. So I'm going to just jump in and kind of explore a little bit, and I'm going to do so by talking about art working and describing art working, and that might feel a little bit abstract and a little bit theoretical, I noticed that when I was putting together the presentation, and I'm going to try and bring us into the space a little bit and unpack it further, but kind of really look at what it looks like and what it feels like by talking about the TAP program and talking about what it is and what we do and how we do it. And hopefully we'll get a chance to tell some stories in there as well. There are some really lovely stories that I really would enjoy telling before we get to a brief outline of the arts-based research that went into kind of really helping the TAP program find its language and find itself. And with this, we will be kind of focusing on the findings of that and those principal practices of attunement and slipstreaming that are part of artworking, how we artwork together and how we can co-create with very young artists. And if we have time, and if we're even interested in it, we can look a little bit at the ethical considerations around running this kind of space with very young children. Okay, so what is artworking? Basically, in really basic terms, artworking is that activity that we take part in of creative processing, yeah? The act of taking part in process art. So it's very relational. And at the center of that relationship of the artworking space is the interface between children and the material world. So the art materials, but also the classroom, the space that we're in, the country that we're on, the air that we're breathing, the lights in the room, the time. It's a very relational thing that happens. We're already at a graph. I'm so sorry. But so these are the three different active agents, if you like, in that relational space, in that artworking space. So we're in the educational setting, and the TAP space is held by the facilitator. And on the inside of that, there are the students and the teachers and the materials that are interacting. And the TAP facilitator is also interacting and holding that space. At the very center is the needs and wants of the children and their relationship with the materials. But very importantly, the TAP space and the artworking space can hold the role of the teacher and their relationships with the children as well. These are vital and they need to be nurtured and held by the TAP facilitator. So this space, this artworking space, and we talk about student-led programming or student-led artworking. This space is very student-led, but it is equally material-led. It runs via an ecology of the materials that we have around us and that we can bring in and that we are interacting with. And that means also the classroom, the time that we have, the lights in the room, the sounds in the room, everything is very interrelational here. Because this is the case and because the aesthetic characteristics of the material are such strong active agents in an artworking space, it's vital that I acknowledge the original Indigenous custodians of the country that we artwork on and the country that we gather and artwork with. Natural materials provide the most remarkable, rich, fascinating, spooky, yummy, yucky, incredible, open-ended, loose parts art materials. And they're beautiful, vital things that children, or all of us, need to develop relationships with. And more I am concerned with creating unstructured spaces for very young people to develop relationships with natural materials for lots of reasons. And so I need to acknowledge the original Indigenous custodians of the country that I work on and with, and note that this country was never ceded. Equally, I need to acknowledge the children that I work with and the creative acuity and capacity of the kids that I work with. You're going to see lots of slides of children at work and play, and most of them are de-identified in the next few slides, which is pretty normal for us as researchers and educators. It has a very specific effect sometimes, and that is it can invisibilize the children, and it is their work that is being nurtured and fostered and created, and it's got my name on it. And I'm an adult, and I'm on an adult forum speaking in an adult language about the lived experience of very young children. So I want to acknowledge their capacity and their creativity. And I take all of my hats off to the incredible, hardworking teachers that quite rightfully are the gatekeepers of these classrooms. Okay, so very briefly, I'll introduce myself. As Robin said, I don't need to really repeat it. I'm an artist. I have an arts practice. I'm very visual and embodied. I'm a teacher. I was a teacher for a great many years. My expertise is in early childhood and early primary, and I'm an art therapist. And so that just means that this thinking and this understanding comes from the intersection of these three fields. Yeah. So artworking is a doing word, and artworking is, it's a word that came about and I really started to feel confident with in the research, but I was using well before that because it is the way that I work with my paintings, and it's also the way that I work with the children's work when we're working together. And I started using it to describe what we do when talking to teachers and talking to directors and talking to principals, mainly because I don't like the word workshop. We all understand the word workshop, but it's got the word shop in it. And there's something about the word shop that just didn't kind of feel quite right. It's very inspired by the way that infants and toddlers and 3 and 4 and 5-year-olds that I work with their world in a really sensory and emplaced and embodied way, in this kind of unfolding, becoming, explorative way. It's also informed by the art therapy practice Artmaking, that describes the active art engagement of working towards well-being and health in that creative process. So I'm going to talk a little bit about TAP, and then I'm going to bring it back to the doing of it, and hopefully that will kind of flesh out our ideas on artworking. Does anyone have any questions at this point about artworking or anything else?
Georgia, Lorraine has a couple of questions. Lorraine, do you want to ask those questions?
Thank you, Robin. Yes, I'd love to. Hello, Georgia. Sounds
Hi.
great.
Yeah, no,
I didn't know what attunement or slipstreaming was. Sorry.
absolutely. And the attunement and the slipstreaming, and I should have put in there, they're part of the findings of the research. That they're the behaviors or the habits or the ways that we work with the children, and that the art materials and the teachers and the kids work together. So when you see kids you see kids in their play schema and their play schemas line up, yeah, it's kind of like they've slipstreamed in with one another's play schemas. You see maybe a primary caregiver or someone that a child is very attached to and feels very safe with, but the child is hesitant or a little bit about maybe sensory hesitant to the art working materials. And you see that adult approach the art working materials and start to touch the art working materials themselves. And then you see the child come in behind them and touch the materials themselves. Slipstreaming, we're jumping to the end of my presentation. I love it. Slipstreaming is, it's a term I found out that is an aeronautical term when kind of ducks are flying and they fly in behind each other and stuff. It's something that I discovered when I was in Canada and watching beluga whales teach their babies how to swim. It's fantastic. And I just see it in the classroom all the time. I see kids slipstreaming in. I see kids suddenly noticing materials move in a certain way and moving alongside those materials and maneuvering them and being maneuvered by them. So that's what I kind of mean by slipstreaming. And attunement is kind of the behavior that deep noticing that you have to take part in order to slipstream. Yeah. Does that make sense, Lorraine?
That's lovely. I love those terms. I'm going to use those.
Yeah, fantastic. Please do. Yeah, no, that's fantastic. I'm going to put a link to my research. I've put it up on an online portal. I'm going to put a link to my research in the chat so that you can just look through it at your own kind of in your own time and take out bits that you like. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay,
so I feel like I'm going all the way back to the beginning again, but luckily I think it might be a circle, Lorraine. Thank you for that. So TAP is very process focused, as you can imagine, as you're getting the gist of. It's in that way, it's capacity focused. So it's because it's not meeting necessarily focused on, it links to learning outcomes, but it's not focused on learning outcomes. It's not focused on behavior. It's not focused on any of that. It's not focused on diagnosis. It's not trying to guide anything. It makes it quite inclusive in that it's capacity focused rather than deficit focused. And the way I understand that I can take part in that is when I was a teacher, and I still love doing this. I love understanding stuff. I love making meaning. I love fully understanding the creative connections that the children in my class are taking part in. And I found that even encouragement, when I started to do the TAP program and fold in those therapy behaviors, even encouragement for some people on some days, myself included, can feel a little bit coercive, and which most of the time is fine if it's a trust relationship. And I think encouragement is a wonderful teaching tool. However, if what we're trying to do is fully spark intrinsic motivation so that we can become in that creative flow state, an invitation that is welcoming, where the participants fully choose of their own volition to take part and to accept that invitation, means that they're able to walk into that agency and take part in that space, and the space becomes theirs, and they can really spark that creativity quite much more quickly, I found. So what we do in the TAP program is whoa, hang on, I've gone forward. We create an invitation to play. Excuse me, sorry about that. And these invitations to play are, well, firstly, they're kind of sparked by the Reggio invitation to learn, which is a beautiful thing where we lay out loose parts, open-ended play materials, and we invite the children to take part in their own way, which is, I love it, absolute gorgeous. Slightly different with this invitation to play in the TAP program, in that we invite, we welcome, and we remain very present in that space, and we hold that space, and we facilitate for that space very loosely, but we remain present in that space. And so what I actually do is, during one of our art sessions, in consultation with the babies and the toddlers, and consultation looks like deeply noticing, offer and accept, and observation, and in consultation with the teachers and in reflection with the teachers, we choose what we're going to do next time. I source materials, clean them up, make them yummy, make them kind of robust, and I bring them in and I create an invitation to play where I lay them out in a way that is welcoming. I know the group, and I can kind of map where are they going to come from, what are the teachers' needs, what are the children's needs going to be, and what are the materials going to need, what are the capacities of the materials, and I can lay them out in an invitation, in an inviting way, and then invite the participants in. And then what we do is, we go backwards, excuse me. We artwork then. And that can look like there's this real moment of unknowing and excitement and nervousness there every time I do it. And I did it, I had 4 workshops today, so it was 4 times I kind of thought, I don't know what's going to happen next, because it's not top-down work. The children and the materials are the ones that lead the way inside that containment. We don't know what it's going to look like. We don't know what it's going to feel like. But the artworking is born when the invitation to play is accepted, and it grows and it has a lifespan, and then it finishes. And the facilitator's job at that point is to notice, be present, be in there, join in however they can, and hold that space. And then notice when it's finished. There is often many outcomes, many artifacts. We're not quite sure what they'll look like sometimes, but there's lots. It's very important, and I'm going to make a point of this. It's really important at this point, as a facilitator and as a teacher in that space, that the children see us treating those artifacts as precious and with respect. Because the way we treat these artifacts talks to them directly about the way that we feel about them, the way we feel about their work, and the way we feel about their experience, because they can see themselves and their hands and their marks and their experience in this artworking piece. Even if once they have it, they may get rid of it, they may throw it in the bin, they may augment it, they may play with it. We might not understand their relationship with it, but we need to make sure that we're treating it with respect. Okay. The other thing that happens, so this is just a nice illustration, I thought, of what it looks like, that lively artworking event. So that invitation to play may start off looking like this. And without any instructional modeling, I will oftentimes introduce the materials and talk about the materials, not like they're people, but talk about them like they have capacity and like they have an aesthetic and sensory personality. And I'll might introduce them if they're brand new and we need a little bit of work around that, but a lot of the time it's not needed. And I'll introduce the materials, and then this is what it looks like when entropy has reached. So there are lots of different reasons why an artworking event might end, and a lot of them are therapeutic, like we've run out of time. A lot of them are educational, like it's time for lunch, or it's time for, for the next subject, it's time for English, or it's time for whatever, or the fire alarm could go off, or anything could happen because it's in that educational framework, or in that educational setting, sorry. But if an artworking event has got its own beautiful trajectory and it lives its life the way it could, oftentimes it looks like entropy, where the materials can't really mix anymore, or they can't be manipulated anymore. And the materials go still, but the kids remain very moving. And that's what I've noticed. And oftentimes I find myself doing a progressive pack down. So I'll start removing the materials that are no longer moving around and interacting. I'll slowly remove those materials. And then sometimes we end up with these beautiful assemblages, or these beautiful little things, or whatever the play schema or whatever the artworking has led us to, we end up with artifacts. We can end up with artifacts. But sometimes we don't end up with artifacts. Sometimes we end up with this beautiful, transient, performative thing that happens and then is gone, which is equally valuable and beautiful. And I'd love to tell this story, if I can. I was working this is in a preschool room, and the week before we had all these grand plans of what we were going to do, and we were kind of continuing on with the same materials, and the teacher said, I'll put them aside for you and we'll be ready for you when you come in. And I, awesome. And I came in, and the teacher was away sick, and there was a relief staff who was doing a fantastic job keeping everybody alive in the preschool room. And there was just wonderful noise and movement everywhere, and it was free play, and that was great, and they were doing a strong job. And I thought, well, this is not, I'm going to have to find a different way of making a space here. And I was very overstimulated at that point, which was fine, because I quite enjoy that kind of overstimulation. It's this kind of bubbling feeling in my chest. And I cleared off a table that didn't have any children around it, and I wrapped the table in paper. And at that time, the kids who know me, I've been running in that room for a while, started to come over and say hi. And I didn't speak, mostly because I was overstimulated, and I just kind of waved and I smiled and I gave us thumbs up and high fives. And I put out some long-handled brushes for everyone that came to the table, and there ended up being about 8 kids that came to the table. I put out a long-handled brush. Long-handled brushes are fantastic. They're really beautiful mark-making tools, and you can do it from a distance if you're feeling a little hesitant at first. And you can just poke stuff. It's like poking things with a stick. There's this instinct there that we need to understand the viscosity of what we're getting into before we get into it. So we started off with long-handled brushes, and I just put a big blob of green, pink, and yellow poster paint, that really slimy, viscous poster paint, in front of every participant. And they started to poke it with their long-handled brushes. And they started moving these marks around the table. And I'm sure it was at first very much about the texture and the viscosity, but it quite quickly turned into mark making. And then they started reaching these marks across, and these marks were drawing and reaching across to one another across the table as they started kind of feeling a little bit more into the space and the freedom and the capacity of what they could do at that table. And it was wonderful to look at. It looked like vines growing everywhere of some sort of spiderweb or something. It was really great. And inevitably, somebody threw their brush down and got in with their hands, which was really cool. And they started touching and moving and sliding and reaching across the table and touching one another's hands and giggling. And it became this kind of physical, embodied, connected pictorial of a web, which was really, really lovely. And I, at that point, without speaking, because the brushes had gone still, I removed the brushes and threw them in a tub. And then one of the artists stood up like this and left the table. And there was this moment for me where this suddenly became quite uncontained. But he was brilliant. He went over to the collage trolley, thrust both hands into the collage trolley, picked them up. They were completely covered in colored cut paper, brought them back to the table and just shook them over the table like this. And there was giggling and there was this colorful cut rain onto the table, and it kind of sprung up and became this three-dimensional moving, laughing thing. And of course, the paper and the materials reached capacity at this point and started to tear. And that's when I started getting some eye contact from the children, because there's some relationship they have with tearing paper, of course, where they think, well, are we allowed to do this? And of course, I just kind of went like this and they started to tear the paper, but my head's swirling because I know that entropy is happening fast now and that the materials are not going to have much capacity to hold the space much longer. So as an offering, I reached out, grabbed a handful of the soggy paper and threw it in the bin. And then the kids all did the same. They all scrunched paper up in their hands and went and threw it in the bin. And then one of them looked at her hands and said, I'm going to wash my hands. And she took off to the bathroom. And they all went off to the bathroom and started washing their hands in the bathroom, spreading poster paint all over the bathroom and giggling and laughing. And I thought, this is interesting. And I got out some sponges and I threw them on the table. And as they came back out of the bathroom with clean hands, chatting away, they saw the sponges and they each grabbed a sponge and wiped down the table, threw the sponges on the table, and then put their hats on and took themselves outside. It was fantastic. It lasted all of about 10 minutes. It was wild. I couldn't believe it. And I got goosebumps and I was like, oh, the bus just drove itself. It was completely self-organizing. I didn't really say anything to them. I don't think I said a word. It was great. And I turned to the poor casual teacher who had this look on her face and she said, well, that didn't work, did it? And I thought, well, absolutely fair enough, because it didn't look like it did. But for those kids, I really feel like it did work. I feel like there was connection, there was joy, there was movement and color and shape and form, there was texture, there was everything that an artwork could possibly have. And they did it collaboratively, which was really a lovely thing for me to witness. What was lovely was I was able to record it while it was happening, and it's turned into this story. So it's not just a story for the kids, but it's also part of a kind of deeper reflective reporting that happens after the artworking event, where during the artworking event, we do this deep noticing and we're reflexive and we talk. And then afterwards, and this is so valuable, we get to go away and actually revisit it and this reflective report becomes like an artwork in itself, in that I get to lay it out and share it. And that's my reflection. And the reflective reports, I can go into them a little bit deeper, but they've got thick descriptions, they've got learning stories, they've got loads of photos, they've got how it's located as an artwork, they've got the, connections to the learning outcomes, the National Quality Framework, connections to the learning dispositions, those beautiful learning dispositions. They talk about the mechanisms for change, but they also have kind of questions for critical reflection that the teachers and the children can take part in afterwards, and extension ideas. So it's a really lovely space a reflective space that we can kind of take part in afterwards. Because in this kind of setting, it would be wonderful if we could all sit down afterwards and reflect on what we're talking about. But in early childhood, there's just not really that mechanism. With primary, I've found with the framework for primary, we really can get together and talk about it. And with adults, we can talk about it as well. But in early education, it kind of just doesn't work that way. Kids need to drift. Yeah. I don't really need to talk about that. I just in that this is the kind of program, creating this space for artworking is the kind of thing that does allow itself in different educational settings. It's run really successfully in USH. It runs in primary school beautifully with art club and with class groups. And it also informed a couple of different universities, workshops with pre-service teachers. So it's able to be very flexible. It's not just an early childhood thing, but to me, it speaks beautifully about what we can learn about the way very young children make art. It was also further developed in a Masters of Research with toddlers, a very small research study, but a very, very intense one in 2022. And that was an arts-based research study that asked two very descriptive questions. It wasn't a study that measured anything or even located impacts, really. Although we went there, that's not what the churn was about. It was more about describing what this space looks like and feels like, and in a new materialist way. So the theory was elements of new materialism. The methodology was a diffractive analysis. And the data was because I was so positioned in it and because I was making art with the children, the data was any kind of data I could gather, basically, plus artworking data from 3 different sites. So one of the data was the artworking from the TAP site with the children. There was also 2 types of nomadic artworking data. I would take artworking materials from the same materials that I used with the children, and I'd take them home and I would, on my own, have a similar art working experience resonating with the artworking experience I just had with the kids, and I would also take data from that. And then I also created art responses to the research, the creative research experience. But I'll focus on the findings if I have time.
Yeah.
Excellent. So the findings, because it was a diffractive analysis, it was this big tangled up, beautiful web of stuff, and you could kind of see the findings through each other. But there were 3 main findings for me. And the first one I will talk about, and the first one I talked about in the research, the first one that kind of uncovered itself to me was the changing roles in the artworking space, that facilitator role, the teacher role, the child, and the material. And the fact that those roles needed to remain intact, or not intact, but be respected and invited into the artworking space. And then how I noticed, I started recording how those roles began to change in interaction and interaction with each other and with artworking. And I noticed very quickly, my first epiphany was that as a facilitator, unlike in education, unlike a teacher or a pedagogue, and unlike an art therapist, I needed to be able to contain the whole of the artworking. It wasn't just the children artworking, it was also the children and the teachers artworking. And it was also, I needed to also contain sometimes noises from outside, sometimes very intrusive things, sometimes things I judged to be problematic. I needed to be able to contain them. They needed to be, art therapy speaking, my client. I needed to be able to hold them in that space. And that's when I started to understand that lively artworking event and that moving, changing event, and how that is what I'm containing. And that's what was contained, the life of the artworking event. And that's when I started noticing what happens inside that event and how we behave in that event, which is the deep noticing and the attunement, and how it only really works if we're really tuned into each other and we're really able to then slipstream in and move around each other. And we're free to move away, and we're free to drift, and we're free to come back again. So that they were the basic 3 pillars of findings and of that diffractive analysis. So that deep noticing, that attunement, that slipstreaming, this is what Lorraine, this is what you were asking about, and this is what I was describing earlier. When I was watching that mother beluga whale watch her baby upside down trying to swim, and then would come in next to them, and then the baby would be swimming around and she would follow the baby, and I was imagining the way the water was moving, and it was gorgeous. And then I started seeing it in the classroom, and the way that we interact with each other, and the way that self-organized classrooms that really run quite beautifully protect each other and nurture each other and move around each other and re-territorialize the way that power moves around classrooms. I just got a little bit theoretical, sorry about that. So so this is a really nice, this exemplifies those things and talks a little bit about how artworking can make a space for being, becoming, and belonging within that that relational ontology. And do I have time to tell a quick story?
Absolutely, plenty.
Oh, fantastic. Okay, so this is a picture of my friend Padma. Padma is the teacher, and Madison. Madison is not Madison's real name. Padma is Padma's real name. She's given me blessings to, and this picture is from the public domain, but I've kind of felt a bit funny, so I just de-identified it. Padma is one of those remarkably golden teachers that you just can't believe when you're near. It seems instinctive. It just seems like it just happens. She's a fantastic toddler teacher. And I had the immense privilege of working with her. And this was at the end of an artworking event, and we were sitting around. As you can see, there's maximum entropy in the room, and Padma at that point on her other side had a child sitting in her lap, and she was also supervising 3 children who were playing with water in the bathroom to my left. And next to us, in between us, next to us was Maddie, and Maddie had a translucent bowl on her lap and was grabbing a handful of green sand and throwing it in the bowl, and then very slowly lifting it to her head like this, and watching. I could see her eyes as she was watching the sand as it traveled down the inside of the bowl, and as she put the bowl on her head, it would plop onto her chest, and she'd fastidiously put the bowl down and wipe it off her chest, and then put the bowl between her legs and scoop up the sand and throw it in the bottom of the bowl and start again. And she did this 4 or 5 times. It was fantastic to watch. And the last time that she did it, she tipped the bowl up and she put it on her head. And the whole time, Padma and I are talking, and she's accepting sand in her other hand from the little boy on her lap, and she's watching the kids. Maddie put the bowl on her head, looked through the bowl at Padma, and just broke into a grin. And without even really without stopping her conversation with me, Padma reached out her hand and dribbled the green sand onto the top of the bowl. The green sand trickled down off the top of the bowl and onto Madison's hand. And then they both laughed. And it was beautiful. It was this beautiful, goosebumpy, a perfect teaching moment where this teacher observed and was able to extend on the play schema of her child, and also validate and witness at the same time so deeply, and share in the joy of that connection. And it happened like that. I mean, it was one of those mundane and sublime things that go hand in hand. And I said to Padma, wow, you just did, this was really, really good, Padma. You just did this and this, and I just saw you do this and I did this. And she said, you noticed so many things. And I thought, no, I noticed one thing. In order to do all of those things that Padma did, she had to be noticing 15 things at once. So what I think is lovely about the TAP program and the artworking space that can kind of come alive in that program is that it can it can just push the interface a little bit and give everybody just a little bit of room, because there's no room in a toddler room to stop. It's so full on. Toddlers, their work ethic is so full on, toddlers. They just go, they just work so hard. And to manage that space as an adult, even though it's an adult built space, is really, really go, go, go work. So the TAP program is nice because even if all it does is notice what you're doing and the genius of what you're doing, it then can create some critical reflection around that. And we can kind of bounce a little bit of love back into the system and a little bit of appreciation back into the system and a little bit of noticing. Yeah. So that's one of the lovely relational things that I noticed about that kind of came at the end of this study that I did, that deeply relational ontology of artworking that toddlers taught me how to do, yeah, and toddler teachers taught me how to do. So it is in this way that I do think that we can co-create with very young children. We can make art with them. I think there's a lot of talk about how we do that and if we can do that and if we can play with children. I do feel like we can. I think there's a place for it. And I think that this is a really lovely space for it to be able to do it. Yeah. Really attuned. So I don't know if we're interested in talking about ethical tensions around this kind of thing. There are lots, but there are, I think, lots in everything that we do. It's a beautiful program. I think that the attunement and the slipstreaming and the artworking are practices that everyone can take part in their own way because they're so relational. There is no real way to kind of, tell anybody how to do that. I do think the TAP program does have a therapeutic effect, and that therapeutic effect needs to be continuously supervised. And I think that if it is, when it is, and if it is, we can allow even more responsivity to our children into that space, and we are able to kind of catch even more. So kind of like, it's a bad metaphor, but kind of like a workout program where you're doing some really interesting things. You need someone to show you how, and then you go on and do your own workout. It's not a good metaphor, but it's with supervision and with an art therapist to install and help it, art therapist, teacher, and someone who is open to lots of different art working ways to install a program. We can all really confidently take part in tuning in and slipstreaming and being with our kids as we co-create together. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Georgia. I think that was just wonderful. And
oh, thank you. I appreciate that. My
I
voice
think
was in the space a lot.
so often, I think we underestimate what all children, young children in particular, can do. And I think you've, through what you've learned and what those early childhood educators have learned too, you show us just how much they can artwork and how much serious work they're doing through play. So
Absolutely. Yeah. I've never come across a group of people with a more intense work ethic. They do that kind of experiencing and synthesizing that experience and expressing kind of almost simultaneously. And it's wild. The heights they reach for are amazing. They have all the spontaneity.
yes. Yeah. Questions or comments, everyone?
That was so great.
Oh, thank you, Tash.
I know how great your work is, but it was great to see it, laid out that way again, and the anecdotes, and it's fantastic.
Yeah, I'm so pleased.
Mm.
Thanks, Tash.
Hi, Georgia. It's Beck.
Hi, Beck.
Hi. I just would like if you could just maybe expand or talk a little bit more about this phrasing around artworking. I'm kind of falling in love, I think, with this phrasing of actually, I usually use art making, but this idea of art working, the recognition that art is work and the work that we put into art making, this lovely.
I love art making too. I think art making is beautiful. The word making is fantastic. The reason that I like working a little bit better is that there's a bit more of a becoming about it. It's a bit more about the becoming, and it unfolds a little bit more. The work making, for me, it's not for everybody, obviously, and not for art therapists necessarily, but kind of separates the art and the person. Whereas when you're art working, you're working together with the art. You're not working from the art or on the art. You're not building the art. The art's also building you. And the way these kids operate, they're exploring and experimenting, but they're also maneuvering at the same time. They're doing that simultaneous, beautiful simultaneous, they've got a beautiful simultaneous feedback loop with their sensory world. They're not necessarily, it's not linear, and they're not taking turns. So that's, I think, what I love about art working, is that aspect to it. And I like art making, but I also got Sean McNiff talks about talking to your artwork as though it's a person. And I read about that a really long time ago, and kind of asking it what it wants from you and who it is, and asking it lots of questions just to kind of get yourself out of that object subject thing and person object that I've created thing. And that started me off kind of joining together with going, actually, when I make this thing, it's making me as well. And that's very much the way that I see babies art working too.
The other thing, sorry, I just would like to kind of reference in what you shared tonight is this idea that materials have a life and almost an end life as well in this process, which I think is a really interesting perspective, especially from a young person's point of view, that, you know, it can finish, and that's okay. And actually part of the process is to recognize it's finished and to kind of pay homage to it and move on. I think that's a really lovely, for me, a new way of kind of considering materials. Is that something that you noticed and that you kind of came to a recognition of, or is it something you've often, or that you already felt?
You know, that's an awesome question. I probably was a little bit forced into it. I've always been I notice when I'm becoming attached to other people's work, children's work.
Mm.
And that's really hard as a teacher. And I think I work with teachers that become attached to the children's work. And then when entropy begins and the children start working in ways, and they go, no, don't wreck it, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I love that.
Yeah.
That talks about the teacher being really invested, and there's a lot of love being poured in. But I've always noticed that about myself, and always been able to kind of go, it's not my work. My work is here, allowing for that. And it lived, and it was there, and it was beautiful. And I took all those photos. My phone helps me. I just take so many photos, and I love my photos. And a lot of that goes into my report. So a lot of that feeling goes into my reports, and my reports are these things that really celebrate moments of those artworking's lives.
Great.
Horrible
Thanks.
grammar. Sorry, horrible.
Could you perhaps give us a rundown on the breadth of some of the materials you bring in? Because it looked from your images as if you just have an extraordinary array of stuff. And I wonder.
My poor husband.
I know you're talking about very important, like pedagogical and relational things and so on, but I'm just really interested in what you think to bring into the room in material terms.
The materials are just as important as anything else. It is thereby the grace of the materials that our aesthetic artworking happens. So I'm always walking around in the world looking for things that the kids can interact with. And I go to reverse garbage. I've got these beautiful Perspex domes at the moment. I think they were supposed to be grow things for I don't know what they were, but I've got about 10 of them, and they're these domes with flat bottoms, and I just fill them with things. And for babies who are really into heavy work, they get filled with kind of paper, or it doesn't matter really what, they can push them around and then tip them over and pull things out, because babies really love that inside and outside, and being able to understand and maneuver inside and outside and post and transfer. And so it really, the materials are anything I can get my hands on, but the best materials are natural materials. They're the most open-ended, fantastically beautiful materials are natural materials. And then I also thinking all the time about dry materials, wet materials, is when, you know, what's this going to feel like on my hands? And I do spend a lot of time, and this was in the research too, that I noticed that when I bring these materials home and I do that nomadic artworking with the materials that I had in the room, that opened up an immense amount of insight into that material aspect and what I can bring and what it feels like. Just having, it's like an empathic bridge that you meet the kids. You suddenly know, you go, okay, well, that having wet plaster on my hands feels very specific. And if there's too much on my fingers, I can't feel anything. So I want to go and wash my hands. And of course, one of the behavioral rituals of a toddler classroom is if you wash your hands, you're finished. You don't come back to the artworking site. So if you're going to go and wash your hands, then you go and play. You know, it's just it's a management thing, because once you turn water on, water is beautiful. So once the taps go on, we all go to the water. So, I mean, there are all these little beautiful aesthetic triggers that you need to take into account when it comes to different materials and how children might respond to them. And being able to have an experience where you respond to them yourself is really valuable. So I valued that. And I got a little bit of surprise at how impactful that was, that kind of nomadic artworking, when I took the materials home and had that experience myself. So I'm always kind of grabbing and touching and also smelling things. Like, you can tell immediately whether or not something's not suitable for the classroom when you open up a packet and smell it. And you can immediately go, oh no, that's been sitting for far too long and has come from far too far away, and it's just shedding microplastics as we speak, or whatever. Do you know what I mean? So I'm not quite sure if I'm still answering your question, but the material aspect is pretty profound of this kind of program. And I'm thinking of bringing some people on, and they're showing me that they've read the research, they're able to understand the slipstreaming, they're tuned in. You know, we're only going to choose people that, you know, that are our people, or that understand, want to attune to the artworking event. But I just don't, the fact that there is this material element to it that is so profound and takes so much preparation and takes so much time. And Tash is nodding. It's intense, right? You run a studio. The material aspect is really something to behold.
Yeah, I had no idea. So I started working with you as an art teacher, like, closely. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm a bit over the top, though. I mean, I think I could I could probably pare it back a bit, but you get excited and you think, and also
it offers possibilities or whatever. Yeah.
Right. You just get ideas, and having an idea about what you want to do before you go and source materials can really be frustrating. So being able to kind of simultaneously form those ideas while you're touching what you can possibly bring with you is really valuable. So keeping that kind of open-ended thing whilst being able to kind of recheck in with yourself about what that experience was like and what would be relevant here while you're walking through reverse garbage touching things. That's a really good skill to have. And also having a philosophical understanding of what waste is and what it is to waste a piece of paper or waste a packet, or sourcing something from a long way away that's been packaged in 3 wraps of plastic. And it's, you know, whereas having a very similar aesthetic experience with something you could pick up off the ground, as long as you don't gather anything from parks or anywhere, it's all got to be off private property. But if, you know, things that you can gather and have art materials can be anything, really. But having said that, you need to have a pretty rigorous risk assessment material risk assessment in the churn all the time as part of your critical reflection.
Well, I think if there's no other questions or comments, we might take your inspiration, Georgia, and experiment ourselves with art working.
Fantastic.
Thank you so much. It's been a really inspirational evening.
Thanks,
Appreciate
Robin.
it. Looking forward to hearing about the research in more detail, which you're going to share in a couple of weeks' time with our research higher degree group, which, you know, will be publicised as well. So, okay, everyone, thank you so much for joining us tonight. All the very best. Good night.
Thank you.
Good night.